So please help me now welcome Kyle Johnson. He's the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the College of Christ the King in Wilkes-Barre, and his lecture is titled Christmas Economics, The Jolly Folly of Christmas Spending. Please give him a warm welcome.
Do you have the clicker?
So you already have a mic?
Sweet.
There's the clicker, make sure it works.
Yeah, good deal. All right.
All right.
So, College of Christ the King. Is that like the actual official name? Is College the Christ? Okay. Whenever I've asked for the official name, they always say Christ the King's College instead of just King's College, but it's probably a little bit more formal. All right. So here we're back. It's our, I don't know how many Decembers in a row I've been here, if it's been that many Decembers in a row. It's quite a few, right? So I don't always talk about Christmas, but this year we're going to talk a little bit more about Christmas. We're going to talk about the economics of Christmas spending. And this comes from chapter 4 of my Christmas book. If you don't already have it, a number of you already do, but I did bring a few copies that I would gladly sign for you after we're done. And a little admission that because Christmas delves into so many different things, to write this book, I kind of had to be a jack of all trades, right? So, and this philosophers are kind of good at this because we're kind of good at reading and figuring things out, right? And so I had to do a lot of history for this. I had to do a little economics for this. I had to do some philosophy for this. I had to do a number of different things. I kind of had to do some politics. I had to delve into a number of different things. And so my own personal evaluation of my work is that the economy stuff is probably the stuff I'm least qualified on. But I have read economists on this and that speak to Christmas spending specifically. And there's some philosophical arguments I'm going to give you in here as well. But it's just kind of like, kind of being upfront and honest about what we're about to do. I did. Someone told me, I forgot already who it was, but somebody told me that I need to write something else because they already have this book, right? I've already talked about this before. Which is true. I don't have any new books out that are coming out. But what I have been doing instead of writing books which is almost equivalent to writing books, is I've been doing courses for the great courses. So I have two with them. I have my Metaphysics course, which is audio only. And then a couple of years ago, I had the Big Questions of Philosophy come out, which is 36 lectures. And there's lots of stuff in Big Questions that a humanist will like. I talk a lot about religion. I talk a lot about critical thinking. I talk a lot about politics in that course. And so if you're interested in that, that's somewhere else you can go. But as just a little plug, since I'm here. That's good. Big Questions? No, it's good. Oh, thank you. But as a little plug, what I'm working on actually right now is another course for great courses on science fiction and philosophy. And there's a little overlap with Big Questions, but not a lot of new topics. And I talk about really new sci-fi. I talk about really old sci-fi. It's a big mix. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and a lot of stuff that humanists will like in there as well. And everything from really hardcore science fiction like time travel and alternate worlds and artificial intelligence. But then I also get into political commentary and environment. I have a whole lecture on global warming in it, and it should be lots of fun. So anyway, so that's what I'm working on now. But for now, let's talk about the economics of Christmas and the jolly folly of Christmas spending. So essentially what I'm going to argue here is this: the way we spend money on Christmas gifts doesn't actually help the economy. This is obviously contrary to what most people say. You think that Christmas spending is this big, huge boon for the economy. It's our duty as good Americans, right, to spend at Christmas time, to pump that money into the economy and improve it, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to argue that that is not the case. It does not actually improve the economy. In fact, I think it actually hurts the economy. It makes the economy weaker. And so as a result of that thesis, we should do the following. We should eliminate or at least greatly reduce what we spend on gifts. We should put a lot more thought in what if we do buy and what we actually do buy and figure out what the right things to buy are. We should essentially only give down the economic ladder and not up. So don't be giving gifts to people who basically are more wealthy than you, that don't need them as much as you do. Only buy what we can afford, so don't buy on credit. right? Or, if you do buy on a credit card, pay it off the next month, right? Don't accrue any interest on it. And then give to reputable charities instead of buying gifts. So replace your gift giving or whatever gift giving you do give up with charitable giving. We'll talk a little bit about good charities to give to and that kind of stuff and what form that giving should take. But that's essentially where we're going here. I'm going to argue for this, and then we'll talk a little bit about this at the end. So as a way of kind of showing that maybe this thesis isn't that novel, I want to point out that there's actually a lot of Christmas history that's like this, and maybe I've talked about this before, but I think these are two really good examples. We have a nice tradition of upholding harmful traditions. It's a very common thing for us to do. So two of my favorite examples, one is candles and Christmas trees. All right, so the history of the Christmas tree is complicated. I talk about it a lot in chapter 3. There's a lot of kind of just so stories. Some people say Martin Luther invented the Christmas tree. There's a bunch of weird traditions that none of them are true. In fact, interestingly, the Christmas tree, like some people think that German Pennsylvanians brought the tradition over with them when they migrated from Germany, and they are actually too late. The Christmas tree was already becoming popular in America at that time, but interestingly, it became popular in America at the same time it became popular in Germany. Early 1800s, both Germany and America see this surge in Christmas trees. Although, interestingly, the first kind of recorded Christmas tree was seen in Pennsylvania in 1810, I believe. But the tradition wasn't actually a full-on tall Christmas tree. It'd be the top of a fir tree, and you'd put it on the table in the parlor. You'd put the presents inside the tree, not under the tree, but actually inside the tree, because the tree was small. They wouldn't be wrapped, because they were in the parlor. Children weren't allowed to go in the parlor. And you would decorate the tree with candles, but you wouldn't light the candles until this little ceremony that you did, where essentially the one time of year when the children were led into the parlor, you would ring a bell and bring them in, and right before you did that, you would light the candles in the tree, right? And you have a dead tree, in your parlor, and you're lighting candles in it, right? It could catch fire, right? I mean, part of the thrill of it was a little bit like the little crackling that you would hear as little parts of the tree would catch fire. You could put them out or whatever, right? But these things would often, full-blown catch fire, right? Now, that's kind of stupid, right? But here's what's interesting about these harmful traditions that we keep doing. They usually make sense in the time in which they are, the time and place in which they are originated, right? But then when those traditions get moved out to other places, they don't make any sense in the new environment, but people just keep doing them anyway, solely for the sake of them being tradition, right? So where this happened was in Germany, right? And what would happen is in Germany, they had houses made of stone, right? And they would often cook inside their houses anyway, right? So they would have fire inside their house. If the tree caught fire, it usually wasn't a life-ending event, right? Your house would smell like smoke for a while, you throw the tree out, the whole house wouldn't burn down because the house was made of stone, so it wasn't traumatic, right? But to transplant that tradition into America, where the houses are made of trees, right? They're made of wood instead of stone, and people's houses were burning down constantly, right? There are still laws on the books now that say it's illegal to light candles in your Christmas tree because people were so dumb, they kept doing this, and they would burn down their house and people would die. And yet we just kept on doing it and kept on doing it. The only thing that actually kept us from doing it was the invention of the electric light, right? And then we started doing electric lights, and still sometimes those burn down too. They're pretty safe now, right? But the point is that even though it was literally killing us, we kept doing it in the name of tradition, just because we thought it was a tradition. In fact, it wasn't even that old a tradition. Another good example, the tradition of holiday overeating, all right? This made some sense. So where holiday feasting comes from is the old Saturnalia traditions, right? And I've talked about the old Saturnalia traditions before. We talk about the origin of Christmas, right? Saturnalia was this old Roman festival where it was a harvest festival essentially, and it's made perfect sense in an agricultural society, because when you're in an agricultural society, after the harvest is done and right before the winter, this is I mean, the winter's really harsh, so you kind of need to fatten up for the winter to actually survive it, right? And B, it was the only time of year where they actually had fresh food and fresh drink and an abundance of food and grain and that kind of stuff, and so they would have these big parties, right? This made perfect sense in an agricultural society that didn't have refrigeration and didn't have preservatives and that kind of stuff, right? Today, it makes no sense, right? We have basically the equivalent of what they would have called a Christmas feast every damn day. Right? Like, we have so much plentiful food for ourselves, it makes no sense to try to fatten up for the winter, right? We don't need to fatten up for the winter. We've got refrigeration, we've got preservatives, we can import foods and that kind of, and we're already fat, right? So we don't need to do this, and yet we do it twice: Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? Well, and it's kind of an interesting question. Why do we do this twice? Why don't we just do it one time? Well, the reason we do it twice is because the Pilgrims, who were Puritans, hated Christmas, right? Because all the pagan stuff that went along with it, right? They recognized it was a pagan holiday. There was all this drinking and sex and that kind of stuff that was involved. So they discarded it, but they still liked the feasting part of it. They still needed to fatten up for winter because they were in an agricultural society. And so they just moved it to a different date and called it something else, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is just Puritan Christmas, right? But then Christmas makes a comeback and da-da-da-da, and so now we just have basically two Christmases. We have Thanksgiving and then we have Christmas. Both of them involve giant meals that we don't need to eat.
Ours does too. I just talked about that.
What yours does what again?
Our solstice party, same thing, lots of food.
Right, lots of food, right? We feast, right? But, right, and if you just treat it like a normal meal, right, then it's just a normal meal and it's not a big deal, right? But what a lot of people do is way overeat, right? And studies have actually shown that Americans put on about 1 pound a year at Christmas time that they never take off, right? So we're literally just making ourselves a little bit fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter every year, literally killing us. We just keep doing it in the name of tradition, right? And it's like, I got to guilty. I like Thanksgiving. I like Christmas meals too, right? I participate in this, but it's not actually a good tradition. So we actually just keep doing it. So my argument is that Christmas giving is like this. If you trace it to its origins, it makes some sense in its original context, but in our society now, it doesn't, and it's actually harmful. It's kind of burning down our house in a certain way, and yet we just keep on doing it in the name of tradition, right? So now I got to make my case that this is the case, right? Okay, so why did it make sense? What are the origins of Christmas gift giving? Well, essentially, it originates from Saturnalia. So again, we talked about Saturnalia, the big feasts that they would have in these harvest festivals. One of the things that Saturnalia involved was this, what Nissenbaum in his book, The Battle for Christmas, calls a social inversion. And what that means is that the rich would serve food to the poor, and that everyone would sit at the table equally, essentially, right? And this social inversion eventually becomes a number of different traditions. In the UK, it's Boxing Day. The day after Christmas is called Boxing Day. Like in their military, the ranks will switch, and the enlisted men will essentially be officers for a day, and that kind of stuff. Responsibilities will switch, and privileges will switch, and that kind of stuff. But what happened later, after the Middle Ages, was this eventually turned into wassailing. So wassailing, I've probably talked about this before, but wassailing was this tradition where it was kind of like a grandiose secular Christmas trick-or-treat, except for people weren't necessarily in costumes, although they definitely could be. If you were a landed gentry, essentially, and so you had servants working for you, right, you were obligated to open up your house for the people that worked for you to come into your house and basically demand your house's best food and drink, right? And you were obligated to give it to them in the same way that you're obligated to give kids candy if they show up on October 31st in costumes, right? And they would sing you songs demanding the best food and drink, and then when you gave it to them, they would sing you songs of well-wishing. And so this is where we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now bring us some figgy pudding, and we won't leave until we get some. Right? That's where this song comes from. It's an old wassailing song. Once you provide the figgy pudding, right?
I'm singing that today.
And you're singing, oh, good. So at least there is a wassailing song in the concert today. So once you provide the figgy pudding, then you get, well, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Nissenbaum argues that this served as a kind of social safety valve, where essentially like the poor were getting to kind of let off steam, right? Taking advantage of the people who took advantage of them all year, right? Demanding the best food and drink and that kind of stuff. But it also solidified the person's, the master or whatever, his social status. Like, I'm the one that's providing the food. I'm the one that has the drink. And so it solidifies those social hierarchies. But he calls it a social safety valve. I think I've talked about this before too. There's similar things going on in the antebellum South. That both like let people let off steam, but also solidifies the social hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. So what happens is once industrialization sets in, right, a lot of times people don't have servants working directly for them. If you're poor, you don't work directly for your master. You work for some rich business owner out in a factory. You don't even know who the guy is, right? And so you don't know any rich person in whose house you can invade, right? And so this tradition is still around, but you don't have anybody to go to. And so what would actually happen is, like in New York City, this is a big problem. A bunch of people that lived on the south side of Manhattan would all band together and then walk their way through the streets to the rich parts of Manhattan and just demand entry into people's houses they didn't know and say, you owe us some food and drink, right? Obviously, the rich people didn't like this very much. They didn't like people trying to get into their house. And so the rich Knickerbockers in New York, including Clement Clark Moore, try to change this tradition and try to get wassailing kind of pushed out. And so they try to change Christmas into something that's not an occasion for poor people to get into your house, but instead it's something that you do for children. And so Clement Clark Moore writes this poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, right, which actually tells the story of a man who thinks he hears wassailers out on his lawn, right? On the lawn, I rose such a clatter. I sprung to see what was the matter, and I tear open the sash and look out, and it's not a band of wassailers. It's one dirty little peddler-looking guy, right? And it turns out, of course, to be St. Nicholas, who comes through the chimney, and he doesn't come to take, he comes to give, et cetera, et cetera. But he's literally trying, and he successfully changes Christmas, and the social inversion's still there. He just changes the axis upon which it turns. So instead of the rich and poor changing places, parents and children change places, right? And at the time, children were actually just kind of considered poor ruffians. They were actually kind of lumped in with the poor and part of the social class. And so he's just changing the focus of this social inversion, right? And charity survives, right? So we have looking after the poor at Christmas time during Saturnalia, right? Before it was called Christmas time. We have looking after the poor here. It survives here, but kind of minimally, right? So there's some charitable giving that goes on at Christmas time to a degree, but it's a very, very minimal. It's not the concentration of the holiday, right? What Christmas is about is giving gifts to kids, and then you also kind of do this charity thing on the side if you got some time, right? Does that make sense, right? Where it used to be the focus, right? You can even see this in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So Dickens' A Christmas Carol plays a huge role in repopularizing Christmas after it had been suppressed by the Puritans and that kind of stuff. And there is charity giving in A Christmas Carol, but it's not the focus of the entire story, right? At the beginning of the story, some actually of Scrooge's betters, right? So in the actual story, Scrooge is not Scrooge McDuck, right? He's not this really rich guy that's got safes of gold that he can dive and swim in and that kind of stuff. He owns a counting house with one employee. He lives in basically an abandoned building where all the other offices or all the other rooms are let out as offices. He's not actually that rich, and Cratchit actually isn't that poor. He doesn't work in a factory. He works at a counting house. He's kind of a middle class worker. And so, but at the beginning of the story, these really rich people come in, and they're actually collecting for a charity. And Scrooge is like, "No, I don't want to give. They've got the jails and poorhouses and that kind of stuff, and my taxes support them. I'm not going to give anything." And then after his reformation, at the end, he gives a large sum of money to those same gentlemen. That doesn't say how much, but it says a lot, and they're kind of astounded, right? But that's the way the charitable giving gives. He doesn't ever give he doesn't give to a beggar on the street in the story. That's not the moral of the story. He gives to a charitable organization that will give to the poor, that will take care of the poor in that way. And in fact, when Christmas makes a comeback and charity is something that's discussed, there is this large movement, essentially, that if you're going to give to charity, don't give to beggars. If you see a beggar coming, button up your pockets and don't let them get in. Give to charitable organizations, and then they can distribute the money appropriately. So once it shifts from children to the poor, or from poor to the children, and now we're giving gifts to children, capitalists come in and say, oh, we've got a gift-giving obligation that exists here now. We can take advantage of that. And so instead of parents buying gifts for their kids, well, the husband also needs to buy a gift for his wife. And then the wife also needs to buy a gift for the husband. And then you also need to be buying gifts for your friends, and your friends need to be buying gifts for you, and not just your close friends, like your relatives, and then all your other close friends, and then even your not so close friends. And by like the late 1800s, you have stories of this comes from Forbes' Candid Christmas History book, where you have store owners telling stories in the late 1800s of women coming into their shop with a gift of people to buy for that's literally a yard long. So they have this giant list, and it's just names of everybody they know, and they have to buy a gift for everyone, right? And in this, there are these things invented called doodads, knickknacks, and what else are the gimracks, I think, were the title of these things, were these little useless baubles that you would buy, and then you would give them to people at Christmas time to say that you'd given them a gift, and people would display them for a little while and then just throw them away. But like an entire industry was invented just to give us something to buy to fulfill our obligation to buy at Christmas time, right? We eventually got wise and did away with doodads and gimracks, but what replaced them was Christmas cards. Same thing, little tawdry bauble that you buy and send and you display for a while and then you toss, right? Same thing, same idea, right? And so this social obligation grows and grows and grows and grows. So you have so many different gifts to buy for everyone you know during the holidays. And I'm saying that this is bad for the economy, right? Now, of course, people will say, but it improves the economy, right? You're spending money. This is good for the economy. This is what Sarah Palin says, the economic genius Sarah Palin says in her book, Good Tidings and Great Joy, which I actually did read as research for the Christmas book. I read it so you don't have to. And she says things like Christmas helps employ millions of people and props up our entire retail economy, right? I was trying to get a quote from Trump who said something like this, but I haven't found any. He just says that we're going to say Merry Christmas again, coupled with a montage of Obama saying Merry Christmas over and over and over again, implying that Trump's saying that Obama never said Merry Christmas, and he did, right? But it doesn't. It does not improve the economy. Sarah's wrong about this. And there's a number of ways that you can see that this is the case. So what I want to do here is, right, so people object, now the spending is actually good, it improves the economy. I want to go through a number of ways, number of objections that people raise to my position that the Christmas spending is not good for the economy, and then refute those objections, right? So some people will say, objection one, well, economists freak out when Christmas spending isn't good, right? When Christmas spending is down, the economy is in wreck. Doesn't that mean that our economy depends on Christmas spending and that Christmas spending produces economic growth, all right? You've heard something like that objection around somewhere, right? Well, the answer to this objection is pretty simple. Christmas spending, all this means is that Christmas spending is an indicator of economic strength. It's not a cause of economic strength, right? So Christmas spending being up means the economy is good, but that doesn't mean that Christmas spending being up is what made the economy good, right? It's actually the other way around. It's the economy being good that generates a lot of Christmas spending, right? The economy being good means we have extra money to spend, and so we spend more at Christmas time, right? Correlation does not entail causation, right? This is a very basic logical fallacy. Christmas spending is not necessary for a healthy economy at all. All you have to do is look at the economies of China and Japan and India. Their economies do not depend on Christmas spending. They are not, flamboyantly spending at Christmas time, and their economies are perfectly fine, right? So Christmas spending in no way is necessary for a flourishing economy. You definitely have tons of counterexamples of that, and in fact, all it really does is help us measure the strength of the economy. Second objection. What we spend billions at Christmas time, right? If you subtracted all that money from the economy, well, that would reduce the gross domestic product and damage the economy. You can't subtract Christmas spending from the economy without harming the economy, right? Well, there are essentially two things to say in response to this objection. One, GDP is not where it's at, right? A high GDP does not necessarily equate to economic strength. It does not necessarily mean that our economy is actually that strong. It's for one thing, it's just one indicator. But secondly, you can have a high GDP and have a very fragile economy. And as evidence of that, just think back to 2007, 2008, right? GDP was really high, and the economy was on the verge of collapse, right? And you can't say an economy was strong if it's on the verge of collapse, right? And GDP will probably continue to be high until the next recession that happens in the next year or two because of the bill that was passed a couple days ago, right, or yesterday, right? So GDP is not something that actually, so even if it does reduce GDP, that doesn't necessarily mean that the economy is better or worse. The second objection, remember the objection is we spend billions at Christmas. If you subtracted that money from the economy, that would be bad for the economy. Without the Christmas obligation, we just spend that money at a different time, right? Not like getting rid of Christmas spending wouldn't get rid of that money from the economy. It would just make us spend it at a different time. It's not like we wouldn't spend it at all. We just spend it on something else at a different moment, right? So you're not actually subtracting money from the economy at all. You're just spreading it around differently. In fact, at best, what Christmas spending does is just concentrates our consumer spending at the end of the year. People don't buy stuff, they save up and wait to buy it until Christmas time or wait to see if somebody gives it as a Christmas gift or something like that. But if we didn't have the obligation to spend at Christmas time, well, then we just spend that money at a different time on something else or for something else, right? Does that make sense? Right? So it's just, at most, it's just concentrating our spending instead of spreading it, allowing it to be spread around. So it's not subtracting anything from the economy. To subtract Christmas spending wouldn't subtract anything from the economy. In fact, without it, we'd be free to spend on what we really need and want instead of wasting money on stuff that people don't want and don't need. We'll talk about that in a second, right? And as evidence that this would happen, I mean, just look at human nature. We like to spend. We're going to spend the money that we have in our wallets. It just depends on when and what we spend it on, right? Objection 3. So I'm saying Christmas spending isn't good for the economy. But wait, people would, instead of spending it, people might save or pay back loans and credit cards rather than buy consumer goods. And that would ruin the economy, right? So what if, if we had this economic freedom, we might do horrible things like save it or pay back our house loan, right? Well, there are a couple of things to say in response to this. One, at worst, the hurt to the economy would only be in the short term. So it'd be like, we kind of go through withdrawal symptoms, right? If people started saving or paying back loans and stuff instead of buying consumer goods, well then, yeah, the economy would, like the retail economy, would be pulled down significantly as people stop spending on that kind of stuff, right? But what would happen is, and so it'd be like, it's almost like this credit spending, this consumer spending is almost like a drug, right? And we'd be going on, we'd kind of have withdrawal for a little while, right? But then once we got cleaned up, right? Once we got those loans paid off and those credit cards paid off and that kind of stuff, our ability to spend would come back with the fervor, right? We wouldn't be having to spend all this money on interest payments. We wouldn't have to be wasting all this money on interest payments for credit cards or for house loans or whatever. Our actual ability to consumer spend, right, to spend on retail would actually come back with a vigor. And so we'd have this dip, but then once we got everything paid off, it would shoot up and be even better than before, right? So at worst, yeah, it would hurt the economy, but only in the short term, right? Debt-free economies have actually existed and thrived. And by debt-free, I don't mean no one's in debt or no one takes out loans for businesses or anything like that. I mean like credit card debt-free, like where people don't live on credit, right? There have been societies where people basically only buy what they can afford, right? And in terms of retail economy, and those economies have actually thrived, right? So at best, and there's actually some interesting, we'll talk about this here. At best, savings, so maybe it would just hurt us for a little while, then it would come back. It might not hurt us at all. At best, saving would actually give banks more money to loan, thus stimulating more economic growth. So in other words, if we do start paying back our loans and credit cards and that kind of stuff, that money is not just not in the economy, unless you're literally saving your money by hiding it under your mattress, right? Your money is still in the economy, right? It's in a bank. This gives banks more lending power, right? This gives banks more ability to finance loans for businesses, to loans for paying employees, et cetera, et cetera. It could actually improve the economy in that way by giving banks more money to basically give out to other people in order to generate that kind of spending and that kind of economic growth. So it's not retail economic growth, but it's other kind of economic growth. So I think that the paradox of thrift isn't actually a real paradox. So the paradox of thrift is something identified by John Maynard Keynes, and he basically, the paradox is essentially this, and I have a little cartoon for it here. The paradox is saving money for the individual is a good thing, right? It makes economic sense for an individual to not spend a bunch on retail, but to save. So you have to pay as much on interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's good for the it's good for the individual in their economic interest, right? But if everybody did that, it would be bad for the overall economy, right? So what's good for everyone individually is bad for the collective, as it were, if everyone's not retail spending and everyone's saving their money, right? And this was Keynes' paradox of thrift. We have the little, right, on the one side, save, 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 tighten your belt, make more with less, and then on the other one, spend, 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 don't be selfish, do it for the economy, right? But my argument is that this may not actually be a paradox, that if we did save, 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 it actually might be better for the economy because it gives basically just more money to spread around, right? Interestingly, and this is something else that Nussbaum points out in The Battle for Christmas, early Americans praised thrift and objected to luxury spending. You have things like, Benjamin Franklin's "A penny saved is a penny earned" and that kind of stuff. The early Americans actually saw spending on luxuries as something that's what those European nations do, these autocratic European nations do, that's not good. If America wanted to survive, they had to tighten their belt and get down and only kind of spend on the necessities and spend their money more wisely and not waste it on jewelry and frivolities, right? They had to make sure to spend their money wisely and not throw it away. All right. The philosophical point I want to make is that, okay, so what I've argued so far here is that spending isn't good for the economy, right? The Christmas spending isn't good for the economy. That doesn't mean that it necessarily hurts it. It just means it could be a neutral effect. It just doesn't help it, right? But I actually want to argue that it hurts the economy as well. And it does this in a couple of ways. And this is the philosophical kind of point I want to make. In a way, it turns our economy upside down. This comes from a little book by an economist named Joel Waldfogel called Scroogenomics. Why you shouldn't buy presents for the holiday. Besides my book, it is the most ironic Christmas present you could ever buy for anyone. It is actually it's a perfect stocking stuffer. It's about the size of your phone. It's a little about that big, fits perfectly in a stocking. And he's got a number of little chapters about how it hurts the economy. So basically, I'm kind of getting a lot of ideas I get from Scroogenomics. But one of the points that he makes is that the obligation to spend at Christmas time is so overwhelming. People it's so unquestionable, right? That even people who are destitute poor, who can't afford it at all, who should be paying off their loans or their car loans or their home loan or their credit cards or whatever, but I got to buy my kid an Xbox, right? And so even though they can't afford it at all, they'll spend $500 on an Xbox so that their kid has an Xbox, right? Or I have to spend money on jewelry for my wife, or whatever it is, right? And so he basically says that we should be spending our first dollars on our necessities, right? And spending our excess money on luxuries. But what Christmas has done to us is it's reversed that. And we spend our first dollars buying caviar, right, when we should be buying underwear. Right? Christmas has us buying caviar like it's underwear, right? We're buying frivolous luxury items as if it is something that we have to have, as if it is something as bare essential as underwear or food or housing or heat. Is that making sense? Right? And that shouldn't be how it is, right? It should be the other way around, where we spend our first dollars on the things that are necessary, and we should be propping up, right, necessary industries and that kind of stuff, and not propping up electronic entertainment and jewelry and that kind of stuff that is not actually, putting anything that's that worthwhile into society. Is that making some sense, right? And so, just kind of on a philosophical letter, we've got our priorities backwards, right? Christmas spending puts our priorities backwards. It also inflates the credit bubble. So I get some of this from Scroogenomics as well, some of these numbers. Excuse me. 2/3 of all Christmas gifts are bought on credit. 2/3. Only 1/4 of that is paid off by January, only 2/3 by February. Some of it actually still exists, and you're paying interest on it by the next December, and then you just turn around and do it again, right? And so each year, it's kind of inflating the credit bubble a little bit more and a little bit more, where we're just a little bit more in credit card debt every year because of Christmas spending. And a credit bubble can crash an economy just like a housing bubble can, right? Now, the housing bubble is mainly what crashed the economy in 2008, but actually people kind of underestimate the credit bubble had a little bit to do with it as well in 2008, and it could happen again, right? And so again, if you know, the bigger the bubble gets, the weaker the bubble is, right? The more likely it is to pop. By Christmas spending inflating the credit bubble, it makes our economy weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker every year. Buying on credit, of course, also weakens a household economy, right? It makes some sense to buy a house on credit. If you saved up money, if you waited to buy a house until you had all the money in pocket to buy it, you'd never live in the house, right? You'd be ready to die by the time you had the money, right? So that can make some sense, but buying an Xbox on a credit card at 23% interest or whatever, like, that doesn't make any economic sense, right? But people are doing this all the time, right? And so it's hurting us economically on an individual level as well. And then, this maybe is my favorite example, Christmas spending creates what Wadfogel calls deadweight loss. Now, what is deadweight loss? Deadweight loss is where you spend more money on something than it is worth, all right? Best example of deadweight loss comes from a lot of government spending, right? So this isn't like a real example, right? But everybody kind of knows the kind of hypothetical bridge to nowhere, right? So the government spends $10 million on a bridge, linking two islands or something like that, and no one lives there, right? And so it goes unused, and so that bridge is actually worthless, but we spent $10 million on it. That's $10 million of deadweight loss, right? Or if 4 people live there, right, and they're each willing to spend $500,000 to use the bridge, right? Well, then that bridge was worth $2 million, but we spent $10 million on it, so that's $8 million of deadweight loss. Is that making sense? So it's when you spend more on something than it's actually worth. We do this at Christmas every year, all the time, constantly, right? We buy gifts for people because we don't know what else to give them, and they're like, oh, thanks, that's great, right? You spend $100 on it, and at best they would have paid $5, right? And so that's $95 worth of deadweight loss. That is, right? That thing is actually only worth $5 to them, but you wasted $95 on it and wasted $100 on it and only worth $5. Is that making some sense, right? And so when we don't buy smartly and we buy gifts that people don't want, right, then you're essentially just wasting money, right? You're throwing the value of that money away. It's much better to spend that same money on something useful or that somebody values. So if they would have actually spent $100 on it, well, there's no deadweight loss there, right? But it takes some effort to figure that out. A lot of people don't put in that effort, right? They'll just, right? This is why, right, a lot of times you just have people send you links, Amazon links or something like that to what they want so that you don't feel like that you're wasting money in this way, right? Christmas spending creates $12 billion in deadweight loss every year, and that's actually more than all pork barrel government deadweight loss on pork barrel projects every year, right?
What do you call it, deadweight loss specifically?
That is what Wadfogel calls it, and I'm not exactly sure of why he calls it deadweight loss, other than like it's just something that's kind of hanging off the side or whatever that's right that's weighing down the economy or something like that. That's actually just Wadfogel's term that I borrowed. And so, but it's like, the money's still in the economy, sure, right? In the same way that, well, hey, the government spent money to build that bridge, so they had to pay people to do it, so that money's in the economy because you spent it. But yeah, you could have done that plus done something that was worthwhile. Right, like you should have done, right? Is that making sense, right? So there's still some economic benefit to it because you're spending the money, but you could have spent it better or more wisely without creating this kind of loss. And Christmas, of course, has us doing this in droves. And then it actually turns out that Christmas spending can actually destroy value of money. This is a pretty simple point, and hopefully it's kind of obviously true. $100 is worth more to me than Elon Musk. If I got $100, I value that $100. I can kind of do more with it. I care more about it, right, than Elon does. Elon's going to lose that in the couches, the couch cushions, right? He doesn't care, but I can do a lot more with $100, right? Because he has more money, and so $100 is worth less to him, right? And in the same way, someone who, like a struggling single mom who doesn't have a very good job, right, or something, $100 is worth way more to her than it is to me, right? And so the value of $100 can actually change depending on where it finds itself on the social ladder, right? So if I bought a $100 gift for Elon Musk, I'm essentially giving him $100, right? That's $100 he didn't have to spend on whatever I bought him, even if if I buy a worthless gift, it's even worth, right? But even if I buy him something that he would have spent $100 on, it's still, I'm freeing up 100 of his dollars that he can spend, but that's not worth as much as it is to me, right? So I'm destroying worth if I give up the economic ladder, right? But if I give a $100 gift to this single mother, right, then I'm actually creating value. Especially as long as I buy something that she needs, right? That frees up 100 of her dollars that she doesn't have to spend on whatever I bought her. And then now she's got $100 more to spend, and that $100 is worth more to her. Does that make sense? So I'm creating value by giving down the economic ladder, right? And so Christmas spending can be good, but only, and actually create worth, but only if we give down rather than up, right? And so giving gifts up the economic ladder actually destroys value. Giving gifts down the economic ladder creates value. And so what we should be doing is essentially this. We should stop buying or buy fewer gifts, right? Especially for your boss who makes more than you, right? Or those who don't need anything, right? Give across or down the economic ladder only and only when necessary, right? And when you do give, if you're buying down, buying across, buy smarter, right? Don't buy on credit, for one thing, and then figure out what the recipient needs and wants, and then buy accordingly. Don't just guess, because if you're guessing, you're not creating any kind of worth at all, unless you happen to guess right. Don't buy just because you need to say that you bought them something, right? If you can't buy smarter, if you can't figure out what they need, then give a gift card. Or give cash or something like that, then you're not creating any deadweight loss in that way, right? By giving gift cards actually create a little bit of deadweight loss because sometimes there's a little bit of money left on the end that you can't use up, and sometimes people don't use them and that kind of stuff. Cash is pretty good, but again, if you give cash, if you give it up, you're actually destroying value. You want to give down or across, right? This way they can get what they want. This reduces deadweight loss, and give less to your kids, right? Your kids likely don't need nearly as much as they already have. They don't need more than they already have, and they certainly don't need more gifts at Christmas time. They probably already have enough. What my wife and I have done, I can't say universally, we have, for birthdays and Christmases, we hardly ever buy Johnny anything. Why? Because his grandparents already get him way too much. Right? He doesn't need anything more, right? So we'll maybe one little gift or whatever, and then we just let them do all the rest, and we can't stop them from doing it. They get him too much anyway, right? But there's no need for it, right? Because he already's got too much. We get him much stuff during the year anyway, right? He doesn't care. He's happy about it. Maybe when he's a little bit older, this may cause a problem, but we really don't get him that much because he already has too much, right? And so be very, very, I can name any names, but I've been to houses at Christmas time where these kids literally a pile of gifts, right? No way they're ever going to use them. They already have another pile in their bedroom. It is just chocked full of junk that they're going to play with maybe once or twice, right? Complete waste, right? How about instead of doing that, make a tradition of giving to charity, right? Make a tradition of going to the pizza place, right, and doing something like that on Christmas Day instead of doing a gift exchange, or do a moderate gift exchange and then go do that instead. That, and then exchange that with, exchange a gift giving with a charity tradition. It can be even more memorable, right, than the gifts, because honestly, right, how many can remember what gifts they got for Christmas, right? Even you or your kids or whatever, can you actually remember what you got for Christmas last year or whatever it was? But I know I do remember the times that we go and do charity, right? Bagging gifts for Thanksgiving, or bagging meals for Thanksgiving or for Christmas or whatever. Those are much more memorable things. So do that instead. If you do give to charity, be careful. Make sure to give the right kind of charity. Use charitynavigator.org to figure out which ones have got low overhead and that kind of stuff. I think two good ones are Doctors Without Borders and then Kiva. You guys probably know what Doctors Without Borders is, right? Have you heard of that? You guys know what Kiva is? So Kiva's really good. They do the microloans. I like to. I'm actually writing right now. I'm working on one of my lectures for the sci-fi course. The lecture I'm working on is about overpopulation, and one of the things that talk about so I'm not going to go on a huge side tangent. But with overpopulation, a lot of people think that offering euthanasia would be a way to quell overpopulation. It actually doesn't work at all. What you need is population control. You need birth control, right? And so there's ways of doing this. And it turns out that you can, mandatory birth control is really morally problematic for obvious reasons, right? Non-mandatory, like making it available, is obviously a lot more morally kind of open. Not as morally as problematic, but some people don't choose to do it. But it turns out when you couple that with empowering women, right? Education programs and changing the way people view women's lives and women's purpose in society and that kind of stuff, it does leaps and bounds to improve society in multiple ways. All of that to say, what I like to do when I give the Kiva is find women in third world countries that need loans and do that, right? Especially if they're going for education or trying to start a business or something like that. And Kiva allows you to make those kind of choices. You can figure out who you're giving to and then give the loans in that way. And you can actually, and I've done this before, I don't do it enough, but you can give out, you can give to other people. That can be your gift to someone else. I donated to Kiva to this person for you. Here's their information. You can track it and that kind of stuff. But this creates value, right? You're giving down the economic ladder. It's going to be used well and generates absolutely no dead weight loss, right? So you're actually creating value. It's a great substitute if you have to give a gift to your boss. Donate to Kiva in his name. He can't complain about that, right? And it's voluntary, right? It's not like this is a involuntary redistribution of wealth. It's a voluntary redistribution of wealth. And it turns out that it's the most ancient of Christmas traditions, right? So chapter 3 in the book, the myth is that our Christmas traditions are old-fashioned. Most of them are not. History is a pretty new invention. Santa's a pretty new invention. Gifts to kids is a pretty new invention. The only actually ancient holiday tradition that dates back thousands of years is giving to the poor. That social inversion of taking care of the poor at this time of year, right? And so that is actually the only ancient tradition, and so you're actually taking care of that. All right, so last thing, and then I'm gonna wrap up here. Two objections that come at me whenever I say that you need to buy less gifts at Christmas time, right? Stop buying gifts for your kids, stop buying gifts for other people. You're a Grinch, you're trying to steal Christmas, right? Yeah, I kind of am, but not in the way, I am a kind of a Grinch, but not in the way you think, right? So here's the deal. Yes, the Grinch stole everybody's presents in an attempt to steal Christmas, and I'm suggesting that you should stop or greatly reduce buying presents, right? So that kind of makes me Grinchy. But here's the thing. What the Grinch learned in the story is that Christmas doesn't come from a store. That's the whole moral of the damn story, right? It came all the same, even without ribbons and tags and boxes and bags. That's the moral of the story, is that Christmas is actually not about buying presents. It's about something else. That's what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that we adopt the Reformed Grinch's view that Christmas shouldn't be about presents. It should be about something else, right? The person who says, I'm ruining Christmas by taking away the presents, is actually endorsing the Grinch's first erroneous view of Christmas, that Christmas is all about presents. If you say, when I say buy less presents, that I'm stealing Christmas, you're equating Christmas with presents. And that's what the Grinch learned was false in The Grinch That Stole Christmas. Right? Does that make sense? Right? And then, of course, people will call me a Scrooge. Right? Now, I would like to point out a little thing I realized here. These pictures here. Anybody know what these pictures have in common? They're both Jim Carrey. I think Jim Carrey's the only person to actually play, right? Like the two most notorious, Christmas haters, right? So now if there's ever a movie about me, Jim Carrey will have to play my part, right? So anyway, but like people say I'm a Scrooge, right? Because Scrooge hated Christmas, No, I'm not Scrooge. Scrooge didn't want to celebrate Christmas at all. I'm not saying don't celebrate Christmas at all. I'm just saying celebrate in a different way, right? And actually, I forgot I was going to mention this because I kind of spoiled it a while ago. If you look at the story, Scrooge was not rich. Cratchit was not actually that poor. They were both about middle-class workers. Scrooge wasn't the odd man out for not celebrating Christmas. Celebrating Christmas was not something that was common at all when Dickens wrote the story. the big thing about Dickens is that he repopularized Christmas and made it to where everybody would celebrate Christmas. But when it was written, Cratchit was the weird one because nobody celebrated Christmas like Cratchit wanted to, right? Cratchit requesting Christmas off at the time would be equivalent to someone at your office saying, it's St. Patrick's Day, give me a paid day off, right? That's not how St. Patrick's Day is celebrated, right? That's essentially how Christmas was celebrated back then. Was as a St. Patrick's Day kind of holiday. It was a bunch of drinking and that kind of stuff, but it would be really weird to get Christmas Day off, right? Cratchit was the odd man out. The Reform Scrooge learns to celebrate, but he learns to celebrate in a very specific way. He gives large sums of money to the poor, right? And I've talked about that, where he gives that big charity donation to those gentlemen, right? He is generous to his immediate economic inferior, right? He buys Cratchit a turkey, right? Interesting little point. In the original story, it's a turkey. It is a turkey. So some of the other television versions and stuff call it a goose. And so here's a couple of interesting things. One, the fact that when Scrooge gets out there and goes, go buy a turkey at the butcher, he knew the butcher would be open on Christmas Day because everybody was open on Christmas Day. He was the only kind of schlub that was actually closed that day, right? Because of Cratchit, right? But secondly, of the people who did celebrate Christmas at the time, Christmas goose actually was the preferred bird to cook, right? When Dickens has Scrooge buy Cratchit a turkey, and I mean, you can't underestimate how many people read A Christmas Carol. Like today, it's like if you get 0.1% of the literate population to read your book, you're a New York Times bestseller, 0.1%. Dickens was like 40%. Actually bought a legit copy of A Christmas Carol, not to mention people who were buying bootleg copies and then people who saw him do public readings and heard about it in other ways. And that's how big it is. That's why it's still kind of around, right? But it was so big when he had Scrooge buy Cratchit a turkey. The next year, the Christmas goose industry goes completely under and they run out of turkeys. Everybody has to have a turkey because that's what Cratchit had. All right? But he is generous to his economic inferior. He gives him a turkey and gives him a raise and gives him some more coal for the fire. Right? But he's giving straight down.
He also provided health care to Cratchit's son. Why hasn't that gone?
That's a good point. Right? I mean, part of giving the raise, right, is because the Ghost of Christmas Present says, I see a chair with no owner, or an empty chair and a crutch with no owner, right? And he's like, I can't let this happen. I don't want to let this happen, right? And early on in the story, when the gentlemen come to Scrooge's office, and he says, we want this money for charity, or aren't there jails and poorhouses? Yes, but people would rather die than go to these places. Well, then fine, let them die and let them decrease the surplus population, right? That's what Scrooge says early on in the story, right? When he's confronted with the fact that Tiny Tim is going to die by the next year, right? Unless these images are changed or whatever, he's going to die. And he's like, well, don't let this happen. And the Ghost of Christmas Present says, well, if he's going to die, he better get busy and decrease the surplus population, right? Throws his words right back at him, and that's what gets him. And then there's actually one of my favorite parts of the story. So if you watch the TV versions, it's really, really weird, where he pulls back his robes, and underneath the robes are ignorance and want, and there are these two small children that are kind of gangly and horrible, right? And it's speaking to this same kind of. Dickens was very concerned about the plight of the poor in the face of unregulated capitalism. Right? I mean, he was concerned about the exact same thing that a lot of people are concerned about today because he saw what industrialization capitalism was doing to people and the kind of wealth disparity that it was creating, right? And this is around the same time of Karl Marx and that kind of stuff, right? There's a big socialist message in A Christmas Carol that a lot of people miss, right? Because of capitalistic filters and that kind of stuff that we read this stuff with, right? And because we watch the Disney version. But that was a big proponent, and healthcare was a big thing, right? He wanted to save Tiny Tim's life, and the raise that he gives Cratchit, he's hoping will be spent on healthcare for the kid, right? So he learns to give money to the poor, to be charitable to his immediate economic successor, and then he spends time with his family, right? He goes to his nephew's house. His nephew had invited him, and he said no, and then he goes to his nephew's house, right? He doesn't buy him a bunch of gifts. Right? He doesn't spend a whole bunch of money on he spends time with his family. That's what he does, right? So yeah, am I a Scrooge? Yes, I'm a Scrooge. I'm like the Reform Scrooge at the end of the story who says that this roughly is the way that we should be celebrating Christmas, right? Giving to the poor, giving down the economic ladder, spending time with our family. That should be the way that we're celebrating Christmas, right? Does that make sense? Right? So yes, I am a Grinch and I am a Scrooge, but I'm like the Reformed Grinch and the Reformed Scrooge at the end of the stories. Right? So there we go. How are we doing on time, Jason?
We are doing just fine. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, so let's do some questions if you want to pass around
Okay.
the mic or whatever. Thanks.
Okay, I am going to ask you if you have a... Hey, good save,
that
right?
was smooth.
All right, very good. Almost had a Christmas lawsuit on our hands. No. I'm going to ask if you have a question. I'm going to hand you the microphone and just tip it back towards yourself rather than pointing it away, otherwise it won't catch you. We'll start with Eve. We'll edit that out of the video.
Right.
Camera's pointing at you.
Somebody must be agreeing because we have a situation with people who have IRA accounts that every year at the end of the year they're required to take about 4% of their investment and withdraw it. And they can take that 4% and withdraw it and give it to a charitable organization, and they don't pay any tax on the money that's withdrawn. So this is a great advantage, and that's what I do every year, and I'm sure that there are other people in here who have IRAs who do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example of the right way to do it, right? You're creating value and giving to charities, you're giving down the ladder. That's great. I wish there was more of that.
Anybody else? Questions for Kyle? Diane?
Question, Kyle. This isn't really a question.
Okay.
But, I kind of want to do a plug.
All right.
So I've always hated the materialism of Christmas, and so I've, for a long time, especially with my family, who has pretty much everything they need, choose a charity and give in their name. And at first, it was kind of a little, I guess, maybe passive aggressive because I would like choose Planned Parenthood or something like that. My mother. Or ACLU or something. Anyway, but so I kind of got a little reputation. But I think over the years, I kind of, a few years back, I found this wonderful online charity gift card organization. So I buy charity gift cards from them, and they have vetted all the charities. So you give a charity gift card, and the person that you give it to has to actually go online and choose the charity they want it to go to. And so I even started doing this with the kids. And it's, at first they were doing a lot of eye rolls and whatnot. But then through the years and, through the grapevine of the family, I found that they really, really enjoy it. And you get an email from the company that says, Alex gave to the Symphony Orchestra of, Texas or whatever. And then it gives you, I guess with the kids, it gives you kind of like something to talk about, and you see what they're interested in giving to. And the little plus side is you get the tax deduction. So
that's a perfect example.
I'll spend a couple of $100 on these charity gift cards, and they actually send you the gift cards in the mail. And then you can put them in your Christmas cards, which mails just, with your Christmas cards, and don't have to worry about wrapping presents or any of that bullshit.
Right. So
It's
what's
called
it?
Tis Best.
Tis Best?
Tis Best Philanthropy.
All right. And what's the website name?
Tis Best Philanthropy.
Just tisbestphilanthropy.com. Cool. I'm going to add that to the slide because I'm giving this talk again in a couple weeks. I'm going to add that in because that's perfect. That's a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. Good.
Anyone else? Okay, well, we'll start to get packed up early, which is great because I'll be able to get on the road. And I do want to give a little selling point to support your local arts organizations during this season.
Okay, that might void the policy.
All right, well, have a great Sunday, everyone, and we'll see you next time.